In this video, I'm going to show you how to cut a knit clothing pattern. So whenever possible, it is ideal to cut your pieces one at a time. It's a lot easier than trying to lay them all out at once, pin them to the fabric, and then cut around them. But what you need to do first, if you have a limited amount of fabric, is to make sure that they will all fit on the fabric. So as you can see, this pattern has 4 pieces. Technically it's actually 5 because this skirt piece has a longer length and then the piece will be trimmed and cut at the shorter length as well. So I've got these set out on a folded piece of fabric, so there's 2 layers here. As you can see, I can fit the large skirt, I can put the back piece on the fold here. I've got the sleeve here for 2 layers. And then I've also got the front piece, which has enough room to cut on the fold. And actually, if I did it like that, there would be 2 front pieces and I only need 1. So the fabric underneath is still available, which would be enough for me to cut my small skirt as well. And I've got more fabric hanging off the back here, so I've got plenty of room to work with. So I'm going to cut the pieces one at a time using a more efficient layout. So this pattern is called the Sugar Pea, and I'm actually not going to cut all the pieces from the same fabric because I'd like to use some coordinating fabrics. But as you've seen from the previous layout, if I was cutting it all from this fabric, there would be enough space to do it all. So what we're going to do is cut one piece at a time. From this fabric, I want to cut my back piece, one of the skirts, and my sleeve. So when you're cutting fabric one piece at a time, what you want to do is just fold it over enough to fit the one piece that you're starting with. So, and this is how you would do any piece that is on the fold. So I'm just going to keep inching that back until it just barely fits. And there's a bit of a roll there at the edge, so I can't put it right to the edge. Knit fabric will roll at the edges. You can get it to flatten out by serging the edge and giving it a good press. You can put clips on it. But in my opinion, it's not really worth all that work to save just a little bit of extra fabric. You can also take the rolled edges and cut them and use them as drawstrings and such if you don't want to waste them. Okay, so now that I've got that folded over just enough, I'm going to slide it up to the top so I'm not wasting any fabric. Using as little as possible while leaving the biggest possible space for other pieces in future. Okay, so let's talk about the different things that are written on a pattern piece that shows you how to lay it out. Okay, so this piece here has a grain line on it. So the grain line with knit fabric is always going to go parallel to, there's an actual line in the fabric, and if you pull it and stretch it, you can see which direction that line is going. And that line will be parallel to your selvage, which is your factory finished edge. You can see that there's some holes in it from where the machine has pulled it through. So that's your selvage there. I have the cut edge over here at the top and the cut edge at the bottom. Okay, so now this is a directional fabric. So what that means is that the picture is only going in one direction. So you want to make sure that these lollipops are not upside down on your pattern piece. So each pattern piece, unless it's a rectangle that's going to be the same either way, will have top and bottom marked on it. So you want to make sure that the top goes towards the top of your image. Other things that we have written on a pattern piece, it will say the stretch direction. So on very rare occasions, some knit fabrics will have more stretch vertically than it does horizontally. And if you're making a really fitted item, then you're going to want to turn it, especially if it's a solid fabric where it doesn't matter which way the image goes. You're going to want to turn it the other way so that you can get the most stretch going horizontally across the body. That doesn't come up very often, and I've never seen it with a printed fabric with an image on it. Okay, so now that I've got that laid out, it's time to cut it. So I am using a rotary mat and a rotary cutter. This is my favorite way to cut fabric, so I'm going to put a pattern weight. Now, there are technically pattern weights that you can buy from a store, but really anything with a little bit of weight you can put on top, and I've never bought any actual pattern weights. So I am just going to grab anything that's around that's about the right size. Let's put a book down here just to hold it in place, and then I'm going to cut around the edges. The other way that I will sometimes cut pieces if I don't have my rotary mat available, sometimes it's buried under piles of fabric, let's be honest, is to place my pattern piece on it and just trace around the edges with a washable marker, and then I'll use scissors to cut it. But I will cut this one with the rotary cutter. Okay, so here's the back piece fully cut. And I just wanted to note for any beginners, so the piece says to cut one on the fold. So that's what that means. The fold line is where we placed it on the fold. So you're cutting one with a fold line on it. So that's what that means. Doesn't mean you actually cut it on the fold line. I know that can be a little confusing to beginners sometimes. Okay, so here we have the skirt for the sugar pea tunic and dress. So this piece is the skirt piece. And we're going to cut one long skirt on the fold and one short skirt on the fold. So you can see I've traced off the long length on the outside, and then the short length here hasn't been cut yet. So after I cut my long skirt, I'm going to cut on the inside line and then cut my short skirt. Now, if you want to reuse this pattern later, what you can do is either just tape the long skirt part back on and reuse it, or you can just print and or trace another long skirt piece, and then you'll have one of each. I could have done that from the beginning, but I decided just to trace one for now, and then I'll cut the extra off the edges. So this is technically a circle skirt. What that means is that it doesn't really have a top or bottom. The image, this is the front here. The fold is where it will be at the back of the skirt. So when I'm using a directional fabric like this, at the back of the skirt, these lollipops will actually be upside down. At the side, they'll be sideways, and then at the front, they'll be the right direction. There are a few ways to get around this. What you can do is you can add a seam allowance to the fold line, and then cut two halves, but you would want to cut them sideways in that case, so that the lollipops were not upside down in the back. They would be basically they would be sideways on the whole thing. There are some other options that involve splicing the skirt into multiple pieces, and there's a great blog post written about this, and I will link it in the comments of this video. Because this is my long skirt, and I'm going to be putting a short skirt on top of it in a different fabric, a solid fabric, I'm not really worried about a few lollipops being upside down just at the very back. They'll look good on the side and at the front, so I'm not going to worry about it. Okay, so I am going to cut this on the fold. So what is important with this skirt piece is that there is only a fold line on one side of this skirt. One of the straight edges needs to be cut open. The other one needs to be cut on the fold. You'll note that there is a grain line on the skirt piece, but that's really only important when you're cutting solid fabric. And that's basically just to make sure that the lines in the fabric are going, they're not going diagonal or anything. You want them going front to back. So you can kind of ignore that when you're playing with fabric that has images on it. Okay, so I'm gonna grab my book again, lay the pattern piece down, grab another one. And cut around the edges to start with. Okay, and I'm just going to cut this little center hole at the waist. Okay, and then I'm just going to take a pair of fabric scissors and cut this part open here along the straight edge. Okay, so one other thing to note here is that there is a notch on this pattern piece. There's a little triangle located on the pattern piece. What that is something you want to transfer to the fabric pieces in order to show you where to match up the pieces later. So you can either transfer that to the fabric using a chalk or a fabric marker or something like that. Or my preferred method is just to make a little snip at the notch. You don't want to go in far, about 1/8 of an inch, because you don't want to go to where the seam line will be. And then that will show you where to match that up with the side seam of the bodice later. Okay, so next I'm cutting the sleeve. So as you can see, I've again folded the fabric just far enough to fit the sleeve on. It can be more efficient with a sleeve to cut, instead of cutting them both at the same time through 2 layers of fabric, you would just cut one and then flip your pattern piece over and cut another one. While this can make the best use of your fabric sometimes because you're playing with different spaces, like you can see I'm wasting a little bit of space here that's not really big enough for anything. So sometimes especially if your fabric isn't directional, you can cut one sleeve this way and then turn and cut the sleeve the other way, and it's using less fabric overall. But in a case like this where the fabric is directional, it's not really worth the small amount that I would save to cut them one at a time. And it can be risky because sometimes you may forget to flip your pattern piece over and cut 2 sleeves that are both for the same arm instead of one for each arm. So that can be a little bit risky sometimes. Okay, so I'm going to cut both at the same time through 2 layers of fabric. There is no fold on this piece. You're just cutting all the way around it and cutting 2 at the same time. So here I've got my sleeves cut. Now you'll note at the top of the sleeve there is another notch. So that's going to show you where to line up the top of your sleeve cap with your shoulder seam. So I'm just going to make another small clip for that. Okay. Now the sleeve pattern piece also marks the front and the back of the sleeve. You can either just remember that it's the deeper curve that is the back, or you can mark it in some way. You can just make a small mark on either the back or the front, whichever one you want to remember. Or you can just cut another notch of your own, which is what I often do. So I'm just gonna make a little snip at the back and remember that that is the back. If you forget, you can always check. All it takes is a quick glance at the pattern piece and you can tell which is the front and the back. Okay, so I've switched fabrics. My front piece is going to be cut from a panel, which is a large piece of fabric with an image in the center. So panels can be a little bit tricky because you want to try and center the image on your piece. So what I've done here is I flipped it over to kind of get an idea of how far from the edge of my piece the image is. And it's about a little over an inch to the edge of the image there. And then if I flip it over this way, about an inch to the edge of the stick there on this side. So I'm thinking that's probably best. I don't really want this stick to be super close to the edge of the panel. Could maybe bring it down just a little bit that way because I want it fairly centered in the chest and not down on the stomach. So that should be about right. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to make a little mark right here to show that that's where I want the fold to be. I'm going to fold the fabric. Make sure that my grain line is straight. And that looks about right. Now, one thing that you can do to make cutting panels a little bit easier, what you could do is take some clear plastic and trace your piece onto it, both sides of it, and then you can cut out a full piece that's not on the fold, lay it on your panel, and then you can see exactly where your image will end up. And that's ideally the best way to cut a panel. Okay, so I've got that cut out. You can see that the top of the lollipop is a little off center, but I didn't really want the stick going all the way over to the edge of the flounce seam. So that's pretty much the best that I could do with this particular panel. It can be tricky to use a large image on a small item. This is a 3T width, so the bigger the item that you're cutting from a panel, the less you'll have to deal with issues like that. Okay, so my last of the larger pieces is the small skirt, which I have just barely enough of this red solid to get it on there. It's folded along the grain line, so that's great. So I'm going to cut this, and then I'm also going to cut some cuffs and a neckband from this red fabric as well. So I'll show you that as well. When cutting rectangular pieces like bands and cuffs, you have two options. You can either use the rectangular pattern pieces, or you can cut them to the measurements that are provided in the tutorial. So I prefer to cut my bands to measurements rather than dealing with a paper pattern piece. So I'm going to start with my cuffs, which are 6.25 inches by 10 inches. I decided to do the grow cuffs, so they're going to be extra long so we can fold them up and have the item last longer. So you don't need something like this to cut rectangular pieces, but it is extremely helpful if you can find one of these. This is a quilter's ruler. They're going to be, the grain goes this way, so they're going to be 10 inches tall. So 10 inches, the width is always going to be across the grain. So my grain is running this direction, so that my cuffs are going to be 6.25 inches wide, so this way, and 10 inches long. So first I'm going to cut a straight edge down here. Just a little bit past 10 inches there. And then I'm going to cut this way. And my ruler is 6.5 inches, so, which is just about perfect. Just need to take 2.5 inches off of it. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is flip it around. And I can place this edge on 6.25 inches. And place this end on 10 inches. And then I can cut my other two sides. Okay, so there's one cuff piece. And for the second one, I find it's just easiest to place it on top. The first one on top of the fabric, and then just cut around that. Knit fabric tends to stay in place pretty well when it's against each other, so it doesn't tend to move around as much as paper does. It's less slippery. Okay, so there's my two cuffs. Now I need to do my neckband, which is 13.5 inches by 1.5 inches. Now because my ruler only goes to 12.5 inches, I'm going to fold it. And half of 13.5 is, let's see, half of 14 would be 7, so 6.75 would be half of 13.5. You can use a calculator if you can't do math in your head. Okay, so now I need to find 6.75. Looks like I folded it just enough if I unroll the edge a bit. Okay. Okay, and 1.5 inches tall, so along the grain. Okay, flip it around, get to 1.5. And there we go. There's my neckband. So that is all my pattern pieces cut and ready to sew.